Can you feel it?
We don't die!
A sharp, metallic tang filled his nostrils as he jolted awake, his breath ragged and shallow. The air was thick, almost syrupy, clinging to his skin with an unnatural humidity. A dull ache pulsed at the base of his skull, radiating outward like the slow unfurling of a migraine. He rolled onto his side, his fingers sinking slightly into the uneven ground beneath him. It felt like stone, but it was warm, too warm, and the texture was wrong. Rough, but with a strange elasticity. He pulled his hand away instinctively, his skin tingling in response. He opened his eyes. The sky was wrong. Dark, bruised clouds churned sluggishly overhead, their undersides illuminated by a dim, coppery light. The horizon was cloaked in perpetual twilight, giving everything an eerie, dreamlike quality. And there, hanging massive and impossibly close, was Saturn. Its rings stretched across the sky like a wound in reality, so detailed that he could make out individual fractures in the icy debris. It didn't belong there. It couldn't be there. A spike of panic shot through him. His breath hitched as he forced himself upright, scanning the alien landscape before him. The ground stretched out in jagged formations, resembling cracked asphalt, but with veins of something pulsing beneath the surface, dark and slick, like oil moving against glass. Beyond that, twisted silhouettes of trees loomed, their skeletal branches contorted in ways that defied nature. The air was heavy, pressing in against his skin like an unseen weight. It carried a scent that made his stomach churn, wet soil, copper, and something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit left in the sun. He tried to think, tried to remember how he got here. His thoughts were sluggish, like they were moving through molasses. There had been something before, a facility, an experiment. Flashes of memory surfaced, blinding white light, a deep rumble, the sensation of falling. But then, nothing. He swallowed against the growing sense of nausea and forced himself to move. His legs were stiff, muscles aching as though he'd been lying here for hours. Maybe longer. He had to find answers. He took a cautious step forward. The ground gave slightly beneath his weight, a disconcerting sensation like walking on flesh. He tried not to think about it as he made his way toward what looked like a collapsed gas station in the distance, its rusted structure half buried beneath creeping organic growths. The metal beams were twisted into grotesque spirals, as though softened and reshaped by some unseen force. Thick, vine-like tendrils slithered through the wreckage, pulsing as though they carried something alive within them. He hesitated at the entrance. The doors had long since been torn from their hinges, the inside swallowed by shadow. The silence was suffocating. Then a sound, a wet, gurgling noise, something caught between a gasp and a moan. His stomach clenched. He turned his head slowly, following the sound to a figure sprawled near the gas pumps. At first, he thought it was a corpse, skin pale and stretched tight over protruding bones. But then, it twitched. A wet breath rattled from its lips. The thing was still alive. His instinct was to step back, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. There was something wrong with it. The figure convulsed slightly, and the movement rippled beneath its skin, as though something inside was struggling to get out. Its veins were dark and swollen, writhing unnaturally, as if something else had taken residence within its flesh. A low, wheezing sound slipped from its throat. Not a plea, not a scream. Something else entirely. His breath quickened. Then the thing's head snapped toward him with a sickening pop, and it smiled. He ran. The thing at the gas station, the thing that used to be a man, had only smiled at him, but there was something in that expression that was profoundly wrong. Not just the jagged stretch of lips over too many teeth, or the black veins writhing beneath its translucent skin. It was something deeper, something aware. The way its milky, unfocused eyes seemed to look straight through him, past the physical and into something more fragile. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. His instincts had screamed at him to move, and he obeyed. His feet pounded against the unnatural ground, breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he tore through the unfamiliar landscape. Everything around him was twisted. What should have been streets were now uneven, cracked wastelands. Buildings slumped against each other, their structures warped as if they had softened and then solidified in the wrong shapes. Some were split down the middle, their insides exposed like surgical wounds. Dark, fleshy growths coiled around steel and concrete, pulsing with a slow, sick rhythm. It was hard to tell where the architecture ended and where the organic matter began. He turned a corner and stopped dead. A city stretched out before him, or what was left of one. Skyscrapers had collapsed into each other, their shattered remains jutting toward the sky like broken teeth. The roads were buried under layers of strange, fibrous material, vein-like networks creeping over the ruins. Once familiar landmarks were now grotesque parodies of their former selves, overtaken by something alive. This was Earth. He knew that now. The gas station had been proof. The faded road signs, the rusted cars half swallowed by growths, they all belonged to his world. But it had been changed. Something had rewritten it. A deep, suffocating silence hung over everything. No birds, no wind, no signs of life beyond the slow, rhythmic pulsing of the landscape itself. He had to find someone, anyone. Keeping low, he made his way through the ruined streets, careful to avoid the thick, organic tendrils that coiled across the pavement. Some of them were small, barely noticeable. Others were thick as tree trunks, throbbing faintly as though they carried something beneath their surface. The deeper he moved into the city, the worse it became. He found a car, its windows shattered, its doors warped into an unrecognizable shape. Something had been inside. The interior was coated in a sticky, translucent film, like a cocoon had burst open. He stepped back, his stomach twisting. Further down, he saw shapes in the distance, human forms, but wrong. At first, he thought they were people. Survivors. Hope surged in his chest. But as he moved closer, he realized the truth. They were fused to the buildings. Their bodies were half consumed by the same fibrous material that covered the city, their limbs stretched and distorted, their faces frozen in expressions of silent agony. Some of them still twitched, faint, sporadic movements that sent ripples through the organic structures around them. They were alive. A choked gasp escaped his lips, and he clamped a hand over his mouth, his pulse hammering. He backed away, his mind racing. How long had they been like this? What was this? Then he heard something, a voice. He froze. It was coming from inside a collapsed building, buried beneath layers of twisted metal and organic growth. "Hello." His breath caught. It was hoarse, weak, human. Without thinking, he rushed forward, clawing at the tangled debris. His fingers sank into the strange, fleshy material, and a shudder ran through him. It was warm. He bit back his revulsion and kept pulling until he uncovered an opening. Inside, in the flickering light of a dying battery lantern, sat a woman. She was thin, her face gaunt, her dark eyes sunken into their sockets. Her clothes were tattered, her hands streaked with dried blood. But she was alive. Her gaze locked onto his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then her lips parted, her voice cracking. "You're still... you?" The question sent a chill down his spine. He swallowed hard. "Yeah." She stared at him a second longer before nodding, as if convincing herself it was true. Then she gestured for him to come inside. He hesitated. The world outside felt too open, too exposed. Whatever had happened here, whatever was happening, it wasn't safe to be out in the open. He ducked inside. The space was small, cluttered with old supplies, cans of food, water bottles, makeshift bedding, signs of survival. She must have been here for a while. She watched him carefully, her fingers twitching slightly as she sat back against the wall. "What happened?" he asked. Her expression darkened. She exhaled shakily. "You don't know." He shook his head. "I don't remember." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, she spoke. "It was an experiment," she murmured. "We tried to fix the atmosphere. Climate collapse was worse than anyone admitted. They thought they could terraform, manipulate the air, the temperature. But we woke something up." His stomach tightened. "What?" She licked her cracked lips, her gaze distant. "It was already here, buried, dormant, waiting." He felt a deep, sinking dread settle over him. "You mean aliens?" A hollow laugh escaped her throat. "Not the kind you're thinking of." Something scratched against the outside of the building. They both went still. A shadow passed over the entrance. Her eyes widened in horror, and she raised a shaking finger to her lips. His body tensed. He could hear it now, a wet, dragging sound, something heavy shifting across the ruined street. He didn't breathe. Then, slowly, the thing outside turned its head, and it looked straight at him. He didn't move. The thing outside the building wasn't human. Not anymore. It stood hunched, its skin stretched thin over an elongated, bony frame. The flesh at its joints bulged, swollen with something that pulsed beneath the surface. Something alive. Its head jerked in unnatural, twitching movements, its mouth hanging slightly open as it took in wet, rattling breaths. Black veins twisted beneath its skin, shifting as though something was crawling through them. Then it took a step forward. Lenora's hand shot out, gripping his arm in a bruising grasp. He turned to look at her, saw the sheer terror in her eyes. She raised a trembling finger to her lips. "Stay silent." The thing tilted its head. It let out a low, clicking sound like teeth grinding against each other. The noise sent a shiver down his spine, something primal in his brain recognizing it as a predator's call. He clenched his jaw and held his breath. It stood there for an eternity, listening, sensing. Then, after what felt like forever, it turned and shambled away. The wet, dragging sound of its limbs faded into the distance. Neither of them moved for a long time. Finally, Lenora exhaled shakily, rubbing a hand over her face. "It's getting worse," she whispered. "They're changing faster now." He swallowed, his throat dry. "What the hell are they?" She hesitated before answering. "They were us." A cold dread settled into his bones. She shifted, pulling her knees to her chest. It started slow. The atmosphere changed first. The sky, she motioned vaguely upward. People thought it was some natural reaction, a side effect of the experiment. Then came the hallucinations, the ringing in the ears, the skin problems. She turned her hand over, staring at her palm. Then people started hearing things, voices, whispers, things that weren't there, and then she trailed off. He didn't need her to finish the sentence. He had seen what came next. His thoughts reeled. The shifting sky, the pulsing ground, the way things moved that shouldn't. It wasn't just a cataclysm, it was an infection. And it was inside them too. A sharp pain lanced through his hand, and he hissed, clutching his wrist. His fingers twitched involuntarily. A sudden, awful nausea rolled through him, and for a brief second his vision doubled. The walls around him seemed to stretch and breathe, the floor shuddering beneath him like a living thing. It passed just as quickly, but Lenora was staring at him now, her face pale. "How long have you been awake?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. "A few hours." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You need to check yourself." Dread coiled in his stomach. "Check for what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached up and pulled her sleeve down, exposing her forearm. The veins beneath her skin weren't normal. They were moving. His breath caught in his throat. It was subtle but undeniable, a slow, rhythmic pulse, like something small was burrowing just beneath the surface. "I thought I had time," she said, voice hollow. "I thought I could fight it." He took an involuntary step back, his mind screaming at him to deny what he was seeing. She let out a weak laugh. "It's funny, isn't it? You think you'll notice when it happens. You think you'll feel yourself slipping. But then one day you realize you've been changing all along, and you don't know where the line was." His stomach turned. She looked up at him, her dark eyes suddenly filled with something raw. Desperation. "We can't let it take us." He clenched his fists, his own skin suddenly feeling wrong. Too tight, too sensitive. The pain in his fingers was growing sharper. Lenora reached into her bag and pulled out a rusted knife. His pulse spiked. "I can still stop it," she whispered, staring at her own arm. "No," he said immediately. "Lenora!" She didn't listen. With one swift motion, she drove the knife into her own forearm. A sickening squelch filled the air as she tore through the flesh. She didn't scream. She only let out a sharp breath, eyes wide as black, worm-like tendrils spilled out of the wound. They writhed, twisting violently in the open air. And then they moved toward her face. Lenora reacted fast. She grabbed a half-empty canister of gasoline from the floor, dumped it over the wound, and with shaking hands, struck a match. Flames roared to life. She let out a strangled cry as the fire engulfed her arm, but the tendrils screeched. The noise was high-pitched, unnatural, a sound that did not belong in this world. The black things withered in the flames, shriveling into ash. Lenora collapsed to her knees, clutching her ruined arm. Smoke curled from her skin. He rushed forward, grabbing the nearest cloth to smother the fire, his mind spinning. Jesus Christ, Lenora! Her breath came in ragged gasps, her teeth clenched. But when she looked at him, there was something sharp in her gaze. "That's the only way," she said hoarsely. He looked down at her arm. The tendrils were gone, burnt away. But the infection had already spread further. She was still changing. She let out a shaking breath, eyes distant. "I waited too long." He felt something cold settle in his chest. Lenora had minutes, maybe hours. But for him, his gaze flicked down to his own hands. His fingers ached, the skin flushed red. His veins were dark. It was already inside him. And he didn't know how long he had left. The pain had settled into something deeper now. No longer sharp, no longer something he could fight. It was inside him, threading through his veins, whispering beneath his skin. He could feel it, growing, waiting. Lenora had stopped moving hours ago. She sat slumped against the wall, her ruined arm wrapped in a filthy cloth, her breath coming in weak, uneven gasps. She hadn't spoken since she burned herself. Maybe she knew there was no point, because it didn't matter. The fire had killed the tendrils, but it hadn't stopped the change. He sat across from her, his own body betraying him in slow, merciless increments. His fingers felt too long, the bones shifting beneath the surface like they were trying to find a new shape. His skin prickled, hypersensitive, as if it no longer belonged to him. And his eyes, God, his eyes, everything was too sharp, too bright, too detailed. It wasn't hallucination, it was adapting. The infection wasn't killing them, it was rebuilding them. Lenora shuddered, her breath hitching. She turned her head slightly, the movement slow, forced. Her neck was stiff, too stiff, as though the muscles had begun fusing. When she spoke, her voice was wrong. "You hear it now, don't you?" He did, the whispering. It wasn't in his head. It was everywhere. A constant low murmur in the air, vibrating through the walls, through the streets, through the ground itself. A chorus of voices, not human, not alien, but something in between, something new. He squeezed his hands into fists, trying to ignore the way his fingers bent too easily. "What is it?" Lenora swallowed. Her skin had turned translucent, the veins beneath pulsing with dark fluid. "It's the others." His breath hitched. She didn't look at him when she spoke next. "They're calling to us." A deep, sickening dread curled in his gut. Because she was right. It wasn't just noise, it was words. They were speaking. Not in sentences, not in human language, but in impressions, in raw meaning that slipped straight into his mind. And the more he listened, the more he understood. "Join us." His stomach twisted. "No," he whispered. "I won't. It's not a choice." He looked at Lenora, and for the first time he realized she was crying. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. "It's too late," she whispered. "You feel it, don't you?" He did. A slow unraveling. His body no longer belonged to him. Every breath, every heartbeat, it was working. The infection, the evolution, it was rewriting him piece by piece. And it wasn't just changing his body, it was erasing him. His thoughts were slipping, memories dissolving at the edges like paper in water. He tried to hold on to them. His name, his life before this, the feeling of being human. But the more he fought, the more it slipped away, because something else was growing in its place, a new awareness. It was beautiful. Number, he clenched his jaw, shaking his head violently. No, no, no. But the truth settled in his bones. This was what had happened to the others. The people in the streets fused to the buildings, reshaped into something else. The things that still walked, still spoke, but no longer remembered what they had been. He was becoming one of them. And soon he wouldn't care. Lenora let out a shaky breath. She pulled the knife from her belt. He knew what she was thinking before she said it. "This is the only way," she whispered, "before we forget." His throat tightened. He didn't want to die, but the alternative was worse. She shifted, pressing the handle into his palm. Her fingers were cold, damp with sweat. "I can't do it alone," she said softly. "Please." His hand closed around the knife. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her face was still human, still familiar, but it wouldn't be for long. Her skin was already changing, her voice already shifting, and soon her thoughts wouldn't be her own, and neither would his. He took a shuddering breath. The whispering was louder now. The city was waking. Something moved outside, not one thing, but many. Silhouettes shifting in the dark, limbs bending at unnatural angles, a sea of figures that had once been human. They were waiting. For him, for her. They were welcoming them home. Lenora met his gaze. A silent understanding passed between them. She nodded. He tightened his grip on the knife. And then, in the dark, he made his choice. The last human choice he would ever make. The whispering swallowed the world.